Well, thank you for joining us. Once again, welcome to Grace. We're back in the book of 2 Kings today as we continue our journey through the Bible. Now, before we pick up where we left off in our previous session, we need to notice something that's very important. Throughout our studies, as you folks well know, we've been looking at what I've called Israel's 5 buckets of wrath. If you've been following along, you've seen these buckets many times. They're not new to you. You should also know that the progression of Israel's story in the Bible, from start to finish, is laid out according to these 5 buckets and the timing of the pourings of these buckets of wrath. Now, we're doing a quick re-examination at this point because I want you to be fully aware of what has been happening as we conduct our journey and why it was happening before we move forward in our Bible journey. Before we came to these 5 buckets of wrath, God had made his great capacity known to the Gentiles. We've talked about this numerous times. He made his capacity, his abilities known to the Gentiles through the first member of human creation, Adam. When the nations that came from Adam turned away from God, God gave them over to their reprobate thinking, the Bible tells us, and he made a division in the human race by way of the man named Abram, a name that God would change to Abraham. It was through Abraham, that God had a special nation in mind. And through that nation, he would fulfill his plan to repossess the earthly realm and have his rightful position as head over all the earth recognized and honored. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were the patriarchs of that special nation that we know as Israel. God then set out to prove to those patriarchs that they had no more capacity in their flesh to accomplish something for him than had the Gentiles before them. The patriarchs would have to relinquish any notion, any confidence that they had in themselves, and they would have to depend solely upon the capacity resident in the Most High God. We call that the various aspects of his name. We follow the stories of those patriarchs early on. From the third of those patriarchs, Jacob, whose name God changed to Israel, came the 12 sons that would form the 12 tribes of Jacob, or Israel. It was to Abram and the nation God planned to make of Abram that God gave the land, that special piece of real estate on planet Earth, the land that had been the previous place of his dwelling and the place from which he had ruled over the angelic realm, the angelic host of the universe, prior to the redemptive creation sitting in Genesis chapter 1. And we've shown that very clearly. The lesson to us, as we look back over all these Old Testament stories, is that from the very outset of the human race, God has been proving the great capacity resident in him, what he has the capacity to do for man. As the Most High God, the capacity spelled out through his compound Jehovah names, and he's also been showing the lack of capacity resident in his human creation. It's been through these lessons that we've been seeing in these stories that God has been proving man's great need of him to do for them what it would be impossible for them to do for him. So it was and remains God's plan that through a believing nation Israel, time future, God's sovereign right to be head over all the earth might be recognized and honored. It is through Israel, a believing Israel, as I said, of time future, that God will make his name great in the earthly realm. But before that takes place, it will require that Israel learn the lesson that God had been teaching them from the days of their rescue from Egyptian captivity. God knew that lesson would not be learned apart from the pouring out of the 5 buckets of wrath that we've been following thus far. It would take these 5 buckets of wrath to bring Israel to an understanding of who they were not and who he is. What we need to understand today is that God is not working in this dispensation of the grace of God through a special nation that he placed under a law contract called the Law of Moses. He's not working today through Israel, nor is he working through the good old US of A today. Some folks might imagine. He's not favoring, nor is he disfavoring any nation, above or below any other nation, during this dispensation. There are those who believe that God has favored America because America's been called a nation under God. It's true that Congress added the expression under God to the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States at the urging of President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1954. And it's also true that America at one time was a nation that at the very least recognized the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not that they had any understanding whatsoever of the message the Apostle Paul taught called the gospel of Christ. Nevertheless, That has not caused God to favor America any more so than any other nation on the planet, surprising as that may sound to those who suppose the opposite to be true. America, as is true with every other nation, will reap the results of what America sows. It's the natural course of events. Sowing to the flesh will reap for America the natural consequences that come through sowing to the flesh. But we need to understand that God isn't pushing bad buttons, causing bad things to occur when our nation behaves badly. Nor has he been pushing good buttons, bringing peace and prosperity to the good old USA because we were the so-called good people earlier on in our history. This means that God's not stirring up a tornado here or there, or bringing about earthquakes or sinkholes. We see those, what have you, in order to teach us a lesson along the way. He's not even bringing the various diseases such as HIV and the latest frightening malady called Ebola. We're hearing that in the news now. He's not bringing those things our way in order to show us how angry he is at us and he's distancing himself from us so that we might learn that lesson. God isn't causing good things or bad things to happen to so-called good or bad people because of their behavior. He's not dealing with men on that basis today. The bad things that happen in our lives today, as you folks well know, or in our country for that matter, come our way because of the improper choices that we, whether personally or nationally, make. And because of the sin-cursed world in which we all live today. The downward course of this world was set with Adam's rebellion in the garden. No matter who it is that we elect to public office, or how devout people may think they've become in their religious world and their personal lives, that downward course for this world is not about to change until the God-man, Jesus Christ himself, returns to set things right on this in this present evil world, as the Apostle Paul called it in Galatians chapter 1, verse 4, a passage you can look up on your own. Now, when people fail to rightly divide the word of truth, thereby being able to distinguish between the time when God dealt with the nation Israel under a law contract with its visible, physical, and cursings and blessings, the difference in that from how he's dealing with all nations alike today during this dispensation of grace, not imputing the world's trespasses unto them because he imputed them to his son, the tendency will be to read ourselves into a passage like 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, for instance. I know you're aware of this passage. It'll come to your mind immediately, and this verse pops up on signs and billboards every time a major tragedy takes place in our nation. You've seen it, I'm sure. 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. How many would read yourselves into that passage? How many today think that was written to us? First of all, to read oneself into this passage is to read yourself into Israel's law program, because this passage was meant for that time. The law program was underway when this passage was written. The my people being spoke of in this verse is a reference, specific reference to the nation Israel in light of their failure under the law of Moses. And the land that God promised to heal in connection with that humble prayer of his stiff-necked and rebellious nation was the land that God gave to the nation he promised to make of Abram. It wasn't the good old USA or any other land. It was that land that was given to Israel. Notice the final section there, the last part of the verse we've just read, and watch me very carefully. I should have said watch the verse very carefully as I read it to see if I read it correctly. Then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sins. Did I commit an error there in my reading? Sure I did. The verse doesn't say that. Hopefully you've caught the intentional error. The word sin in this verse is not plural. It's singular. This tells us that the sin that God had in mind in this passage was a national sin. The sin of the people of Israel committed as a nation this particular sin. This statement in 2 Chronicles chapter 7 takes us right back to Leviticus chapter 26, verse 40. Where God told Israel in connection with these 5 buckets of wrath we looked at a moment ago, that the opportunity was always there for that nation. Israel always had the opportunity to confess that they lied when their forefathers had promised that the nation could earn their righteousness through performance according to the law. I want to talk about Israel's corporate confession just a bit more today, because I believe it's a confession that's most often misunderstood and misunderstanding this confession has caused a lot of confusion for more than a few folks when it comes to a passage such as 1 John 1:9. I think many of you are familiar with it. First of all, look back at 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14. Look at that passage for a moment longer. Notice the direction that God was taking in connection with the prayer being called for in that verse. The verse begins with, if my people, which are called by my name. Now stop there for a moment. If you're a believer during this dispensation of the grace of God, it's easy to see yourself as belonging to God and therefore being numbered along with the my people being spoken of in this passage. Why might some folks assume that they are the my people here? The answer is because you do belong to God if you've believed Paul's gospel. You're his, he's yours. Having believed the gospel of Christ, you are joined to God's God-man, Jesus Christ himself. You've become one with him. But keep in mind, the Gentiles were not God's people when this passage was written. God had already given the Gentiles over to their reprobate thinking, and God was dealing solely with one nation, the nation Israel, and those folks were the my people in the passage. This verse here was aimed solely at the people that God considered to be his people at that time. God was talking to a specific group of people when 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14 was written, a people under a law. He was speaking to the people that he had Moses rescue from Egyptian captivity. Notice the identity of the my people statement in Exodus chapter 3 verse 10. Come now therefore, Moses, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth what? My people. And who were his people? Here it is in the verse. The children of Israel out of Egypt. So if we don't see the specificity there and understand this is a passage to Israel, we're going to read ourselves into it and think that every bad thing comes our way has come from God. It should be clear enough who God's people were when this passage was written. God had a special place in mind for the my people of this passage, as we see in 1 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 9. Also, I will order a place for, who does it say here? My people Israel, and will plant them, and they shall dwell in their place, and shall be moved no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness waste them anymore, as at the beginning. God's people were the people of the nation Israel, plain and simple. The place where he would plant them would be the land that he had promised them. The psalmist had no problem identifying the people who were considered God's people, the people God was calling upon to humble themselves and pray in order that God might heal their land. He identified God's people very accurately in Psalm 90, verse 7, and Psalm 81, verse 8, for that matter. Watch how the psalmist named them, and we'll put these verses up together. Hear, O my people, and I will speak, O Israel, and I will testify against thee. I am God, even thy God. There's the my people Israel. Psalms 81, verse 8, for instance. Don't have it on the passage there. Psalms 81, verse 8 says, Hear, O people, and I will testify unto thee, O Israel, if thou wilt hearken unto me. The question is, would God's people Israel hearken unto him? The psalmist answered that question as well in Psalms chapter 81, verses 11 and 13. But my people, namely Israel, but my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me. Psalms 81:13, Oh, that my people, Israel, had hearkened unto me, and Israel had walked in my ways. So we see that's pointed here. It's directed at a nation. If you've caught the identity behind the expression, my people, in the verses we've just read, where God's people were identified very clearly, then you know to whom God was speaking in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, when he said, If my people, which are called by my name, the nation Israel, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin, singular, and I will heal their land. Their land definitely needed healing at that time, if you think back. Not that it doesn't need healing today, for that matter. Number one, while Israel was given a taste of their kingdom to come and the peace and prosperity associated with that future kingdom, while Kings David and Solomon were on the throne, that peace and prosperity was short-lived at best. Israel's enemies remained in the land. and the land that God had given to Israel. So Israel had only been able to enjoy fleeting peace, and from time to time. Number two, there was an extreme drought in the land at that time. The second bucket of wrath had fallen upon the nation, and the land that God promised his people had become a parched land. Their heaven had become as iron, and their earth as brass, as we discovered earlier. We read about the drought that had come upon the land in that day as Elijah had caused the rains to cease for 3.5 years in connection with bucket of wrath number 2. That drought, of course, brought what drought always brings, a natural consequence, which was famine in the land. Nothing would grow. Israel's land was in definite need of healing. Number 3, the land needed healing in an additional way. Wild beasts had taken dominion of the land that God had given to his people, Israel. They couldn't journey outside their protective walls of their cities, else the ferocious animals of bucket of wrath number 3 would devour them. The only thing that would bring peace, safety, and prosperity Israel's way would be for God to heal their land. In other words, for God to take away the repercussions of the buckets of wrath that the people of Israel had brought upon themselves when they had sworn that they had the capacity to earn their righteousness before God through their performance. So let's read that passage in 2 Chronicles 7:14 one additional time. If my people, which are called by my name, that would be Israel, shall humble themselves. Why, they'd been the precise opposite of humble. They had foolishly supposed that they had it in them to live up to the dictates of the law of Moses, both perfectly and consistently, in spite of the clear evidence through these buckets of wrath that God had proven the contrary to be true. They needed to humble themselves, for sure, as God said, and pray, make their confession of their failure under the law contract, and seek my face to be for them what they couldn't be for themselves, and turn away from their wicked ways. Put simply, they needed to call upon and cast themselves upon the capacity resident in the name of the Most High God, rather than place any confidence in the capacity of their flesh. They also needed to cease worshiping the gods, little g, of the peoples around them. This is what their wicked ways were all about, as we've seen time and again in the stories of their various kings. The opportunity to make their confession, the confession of failure under the law contract, that was the confession, had been sitting before them throughout the days of their rebellion. The problem was they refused to make their confession. Had they made it, God promised what he would do, as seen in the remainder of 2 Chronicles 7:14. Then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin, singular. They swore falsely when they said they could live up to the law, and will heal their land. Now, how many in the nation Israel would need to make that confession that they had failed under the law contract? Well, how many in the nation Israel had promised they had the capacity to live up to the dictates of the law contract when the law was first handed down? Here it is once again, as we saw earlier in Exodus chapter 19, verse 8. And how many does it say here? All the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we, corporately, as a nation, will do. And Moses returned those words of the people unto the Lord. That's what brought about these 5 buckets of wrath. The answer as to how many in Israel would need to make their confession of law contract failure is answered when we discover how many in Israel, no matter the time frame, had failed to keep the law of Moses successfully. It's as simple as that. Since no one in Israel had been able to successfully live up to the dictates of the law of Moses, everyone who wanted to be numbered with the people of Israel would have to make their confession that they had failed to perform, as their fathers had sworn the nation to be capable of performing. Notice not only the corporate nature of the proposal that God had in mind, but the conditional nature of God's corporate proposal to Israel, as written in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. Now therefore, if ye, who are my people here? Israel. If ye as a nation, Israel, will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye, Israel, shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people. In other words, a nation above all nations, Gentiles. For all the earth is mine, and ye, Israel, shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. The Apostle Paul later on, and then to Gentiles. Wrong. It's not to us. It wasn't to Paul. This is to Israel. The confusion we've been talking about was built into that covenant, or not the confusion, I should say the confusion, the confession that they were to make was built into the covenant itself in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 40, where it says, if they, Israel, shall confess their iniquity. To obey his voice, folks, would have been to make the called for confession of law contract failure. As you can see, there's nothing in that Exodus chapter 19 passage, nor is there anything sitting in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 40, about a citizenship in heaven, nor about ruling over the angelic realm, because those things were never promised to the nation Israel. A land was promised to those folks. There's also nothing at all sitting in either passage about the Gentiles, because these weren't passages written about the Gentiles. All the passages we've examined thus far in our journey through the Bible were designed expressly for, written specifically to and about God's people at that time, the people of Israel. Don't read yourself into these things. Now, let's not stop there. Stay with me for a moment. We've already seen how everyone in Israel was responsible to make the confession that they had failed the law contract, the confession that they had indeed sinned when the contract included a no-sin mandate, the confession that even the leadership of the nation would be required to make in order for Israel to become God's treasured possession, a nation above all nations of the earth, a holy nation and kingdom of priests. That would not come about for the nation till they had made their confession. The law of Moses was spelled out in Leviticus along with the ramifications of failing that contract. So in effect, the confession that God called upon Israel to make, the confession sitting in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 40, was written into the law contract itself. It was as much a part of the law contract as any other part of the law contract. And so Israel still must make that confession today. If a Jew under the law of Moses made his confession that he, along with all the people before him in Israel, had come short of fulfilling the law that Israel had been placed under, God forgave that person for their law contract failure and counted that person to be a part of true Israel. If a person refused to make the required confession, even though that person was related to Abraham by lineage, that person would not be numbered with true Israel. This is why the Apostle Paul would say later on down the road in Romans chapter 9, verse 6, "For they are not all Israel which are of Israel." God only acknowledged those people of Israel who were willing to make their law failure confession as belonging to him. Those refusing to make their confession had no part in him. Listen to what the Apostle John had to say, knowing Paul's gospel by the time 1 John was written. As John was writing to those Jews in the outlying areas who knew Christ to be Israel's Messiah. They knew that very well. He was the Son of God, but they had not known what Christ's crosswork accomplished for them where their sins were concerned. First thing those Jews needed to know was that confessing their law contract failure was something they needed to do, something the nation as a whole needed to do if they were to ever to be restored to their place of prominence. Bear in mind, these were Jews who had been born under the law contract. But as you know, many of those folks had felt themselves to be above sin. They were the good people. Sin was for the Gentiles, not for them. After all, they had the law contract. Should they now confess that they had indeed failed that law contract? Can you imagine some of their thinking? Might a confession of law contract failure, when that would be what gained them the kingdom, would that keep them out of the coming kingdom because it was keeping that law that they were supposed to do to have the kingdom? To confess they'd failed, would that keep them out of the kingdom? This is where 1 John chapter 1, verses 8 and 9 come into play. If we, Israel, those were the folks to whom John was writing, if we say that we as a nation have no sin, singular, meaning no sin nature, no inclination to sin, we as a nation deceive ourselves, and truth is not in us. Again, John wasn't writing to Gentiles, folks. He was writing to the Jews who had been under that law contract. If we, Israel, confess our sins, make our law failure confession, they'd missed it. They'd missed the boat when it came to fulfilling that contract. The confession Leviticus 26:40 calls upon us of Israel to make. He's faithful and just to forgive us our sins, and us, being Israel, and cleanse us from all law failure unrighteousness. Do you see it? You can hear the wheels turning in some of these folks' minds. John, would confession of our law contract failures and the cleansing that confession brings to those who are willing to make that confession mean that we no longer have to worry about breaking the contract? Can we put it behind us? John, does this confession mean that we can now go out and ignore the contract altogether and sin all the more? You know someone else that answered a question like that? Will God not count our future violations as a nation, the violations of the law contract against us nationally? Jump ahead with me to 1 John chapter 2, verse 1. My little children, these things write unto you that ye sin not. What did Paul say? Should we sin so that grace abound? In other words, I'm not writing these things to you to set you off on a sin project, John was telling them. Sin didn't magically become any more favorable to God than it had ever been. God hates sin, but God is no longer judging you according to the law contract. And if any man sin, watch me closely, that man can go and ask God the Father to forgive him for that sin. In fact, you should keep asking for new forgiveness all along the way. Is that what it says? Is that what John said? No. He did not. If any man sin, we of Israel who have made our law failure confession, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. Do you see what he's saying? Wait, John, are you telling us that we can now bypass the Father altogether and ask Jesus Christ to forgive us every time we sin and that he just might grant us that request? Are we to pray to Christ now and not to the Father? Listen to John answer his Jewish listeners in 1 John chapter 2, verse 12. I write unto you, little children, because your sins, plural, are all-inclusive, are forgiven you for his, Christ's name's sake. He's telling them their sins are forgiven them for Christ's name's sake. Oh, you mean we don't have to keep on making our law failure confessions once we've made that confession? That's precisely what John was telling them, folks. And that, by the way, is what the Apostle Paul revealed to the Gentiles in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, where Paul made this statement, listen to the, for Christ's name's sake, be kind one to another, you Gentiles, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for, notice the similar expression, for Christ's sake hath already, as the verb tense, forgiven you. You see the difference? John knew Paul's message by the time 1 John was written. He knew about what the cross accomplished for the people of Israel. These Jews to whom John was writing knew the law contract. They knew that Christ was the Messiah, the Son of the living God, but they hadn't known what Christ's death, burial, and resurrection had accomplished for them where their sins are concerned. The law contract allowed for no sin. Would they be ready to confess that sin had been an integral part of their lives? John wanted them to make that confession because God would insist that confession be made by the nation in order to restore that nation to its place of prominence among the nations. Nothing to do with us. Everything to do with my people Israel. Contrary to what some of them may have been thinking, making their confessions of law contract failure wouldn't cause God to give up on them, as John explained in chapter 5, verse 13. These things have I written unto you that believe on the name of the Son of God, that ye may know that ye have eternal life. You don't have to wonder about it, John was telling Israel. You don't have to question it. You can know it of a certainty, you who have made your law contract failure confession, and that ye may believe, continue trusting on the name of the Son of God. We weren't under a law. So we have no law contract failure confession to make because God's never said, I'm going to place you Gentiles above every nation on the earth. And you're going to be a peculiar treasure unto me, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. That wasn't about us. But how many today are teaching that we are a kingdom of priests once we come to faith? No, we're not. Israel will be in a time yet future. We never will be. That's not our position. That's not our promise. That's not our program. So what we need to understand is that Israel's law contract confession had always been sitting there for Israel to make. The buckets of wrath we've been talking about in these studies were designed to prove to the nation that they had not, nor could they ever, merit righteousness before God through their performance. But in spite of the testimony of their law contract failure, the continual falling of these buckets was demonstrating that the vast majority of the nation refused to make the confession that Leviticus 26:40 called for. Called upon those people under the contract to make. Now, we're not under that contract. We don't have a law failure confession to make to become anything. Do we need to acknowledge that we're sinful people, just like Israel? Paul teaches us that. Of course we do. But why would you accept what Christ accomplished where your sins are concerned if you didn't know you had any sins for Christ to accomplish something for? So of course we need to understand we're sinful. Paul makes that clear. But he never calls upon us to make a law contract confession because we were never under the law. We were under, you say it, grace. The nation hadn't made their law contract confession during the days of Joshua. They'd not made their law contract confession during the days of the judges, as we saw. And as we've been seeing in the study of the kings, they were continuing to ignore the law failure confession the law contract called for, even after the pouring of the first 3 buckets of wrath. Instead, they were setting themselves up for the pouring of bucket of wrath number 4. Elijah, as you recall, had been God's prophet during the pouring out of bucket of wrath number 2. He was the prophet who withheld the rain that resulted in that famine in the land. Then after backing out of the land, as we saw him do, symbolic there, Elijah's mantle fell to Elisha, who called for the third bucket of wrath to fall. Elisha was a prophet of the third bucket. That third bucket having to do with a wild beast that began to adversely affect the population of the nation. Those wild beasts began to reduce Israel's numbers, the verse said. The people had to remain in their walled cities to take refuge from the ferocious animals that were wreaking havoc by attacking all those who dared venture out. It should be clear as we read through these Old Testament stories that these buckets of wrath were designed to teach Israel to abandon any notion whatsoever of worshiping the false gods of those around them, and to confess that their failure to perform according to the law contract, as their forefathers had sworn they were capable of doing, should be made, yet they didn't make it. They refused to learn the lesson of their incapacity. And they were continually not ready to make their confession, much less depend solely upon God's capacity and not their own. Glance back with me for a moment to the picture of Israel's total 5 buckets of wrath. I want you to notice that we will not finish the book of 2 Kings before the 4th bucket of wrath falls upon the nation. We'll see that today. Not only will the 4th bucket fall, but bucket number 5 will also begin to pour out during the book of 2 Kings, the book we're in right now. Keep in mind, Israel's 5th bucket of wrath called for the people of Israel to be taken out of their land altogether. The 5 buckets of wrath, the 5th bucket is the final bucket of wrath that God had in store for the nation. When that 5th bucket is empty, they get their king and they get their kingdom. So it's important as we go through Scripture to see where we are today in relation to those 5 buckets, and we'll see we're not sitting in any of those buckets. With the fall of each bucket, beginning with bucket number 1, Israel's enjoyment, her capacity to enjoy the land would be diminished. And with each ensuing bucket, diminished even more so. And also, the land's capacity to produce and provide for Israel would start being diminished with each pouring of the bucket. The story of the kings and Israel's desire to be ruled over in the same manner as the peoples around them didn't change for the better. Instead, the downward trek continued for the northern kingdom. Elisha performed miracles as God's prophet, showing the capacity of the Most High God to be everything for his people they would ever need him to become for them. But that didn't change the course of the kings of Elisha's day. They had set a course for themselves, and they continued to follow it. They continued to do evil in the sight of the Lord, as we saw that expression used over and over in connection with the kings. By the time we come to 2 Kings, chapter 9, we see a man named Jehu, and he begins to take center stage here. Jehu had been a soldier in King Ahab's army, and you see Ahab is the 7th king. Who was Ahab married to? Jezebel. We're going to see her a little bit more today. Well, Jehu had been a soldier in King Ahab's army. Ahab had been a king over the northern realm, the king who married that wicked Jezebel, who we talked about. Ahab had not been a good king, as many of you will recall. In fact, the last thing we read about King Ahab came in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 16, verses 30 through 32. Let's pull these verses back up just momentarily here. We'll pull them to the forefront just to refresh our thinking. And Ahab, the son of Omni, did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. Not a good guy. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians. And Ahab went and served Baal and worshipped Baal. He worshipped the false god. Here you've got a king over the northern kingdom who is worshiping Baal rather than worshiping the Most High God. Not only was he worshiping Baal, but Ahab was furthering the worship of Baal, as we see in the next 2 verses, verses 32 and 33. And he, King Ahab that is, reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. So he's even built a temple for Baal. And Ahab made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. You see a downward trek here? Israel's King Ahab was an idol worshiper, pure and simple. After King Ahab came King Ahaziah, the king who fell through the lattice in the upper chamber that we talked about earlier on. The king who died, as we noted in our previous session. After the death of King Ahaziah, Jehoram, also called Joram in the Bible, both names are used. Joram came to reign over the northern kingdom as Israel's 9th king. You can see him listed there. This is where Jehu, who had been a soldier in King Ahab's army, enters the picture in a prominent way. It's an interesting story and one we're going to follow a little bit. King Jehoram of the northern kingdom and King Ahaziah of the southern kingdom allied together to fight the king of Syria. Is it not interesting to see the conflict that still exists between the current Israel of our day and Syria today still playing itself out? As someone once said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. As the story has it, King Jehoram of Israel was wounded in that Syrian conflict. So he journeyed on to Jezreel to take some time out to recover. Concerned over his injury, King Ahaziah of the southern kingdom, remember they'd allied together to fight Syria, the southern kingdom of Judah, a different Ahaziah, by the way, than the Ahaziah of the northern kingdom, went to visit Jehoram at Jezreel. I'm going to go see my compatriot here. We fought together in this battle against Syria. I wonder how he's doing. I know he was injured. This takes place in 2 Kings chapter 8. As you see, we're moving through 2 Kings. While both kings were away, the military commanders of both armies came together to discuss strategy. Well, Jehu, a commander of the northern kingdom, had been a part of that meeting. He was a commander. But little did Jehu know at that time that God had given Elisha instruction to send a young prophet to meet Jehu at that meeting and anoint him to be king over Israel, the northern kingdom. In other words, Jehoram, you're out. Jehu, you're in. As 2 Kings chapter 9 gets underway, we see the commanders of Israel realizing what was happening through that prophet, and they proclaim Jehu to be the rightful king. As the story continues in chapter 9, we find that not only did the young prophet from Elisha anoint Jehu as king over the northern kingdom, he told Jehu that God had a special project in mind for him. Jehu was to utterly destroy the house of Ahab due to all that Baal worship that Ahab had been performing and promoting. Would Jehu do as God directed him to do? Well, he set out for Jezreel to find King Jehoram. We say Jehoram. Jehu had been given a job to do, and if he was going to destroy the house of Ahab, he would have to destroy Jehoram because Jehoram was part of the house of Ahab. And it was up to Jehu to make Jehoram's exit take place. Now, as Jehu approached the city of Jezreel, he's after Jehoram. Jehoram is now called Joram in the text, or Joram. Joram sent a messenger. He knew he was coming, so he sent a messenger on horseback to see if Jehu had come in peace. Let's pick up the story in 2 Kings chapter 9, beginning with verse 17. And there stood a watchman on the tower in Jezreel, and he spied the company of Jehu as Jehu was coming toward Jezreel, and said, I see a company. And Joram said, take a horseman, and send to meet them, and let them, the horsemen, say, is it peace? What are you up to here, Jehu? Verse 8. So there went one on horseback to meet Jehu, and said, thus saith the king, is it peace? And Jehu said, what hast thou to do with peace? Turn thee behind me. Ooh, not a friendly greeting. And the watchman told Joram, saying, the messenger came to them, but he cometh not again. He didn't come back. In other words, he never came back with Jehu's reply. He left, but he never came back. So what did King Joram do? Well, he sent another rider on horseback with the same inquiry. And in verses 19 and 20, as that continues the story, then he, Joram, sent out a second on horseback, which came to them and said, thus saith the king, Joram, is it peace? Have you come peacefully? And Jehu answered, what hast thou to do with peace? Turn thou behind me. And the watchman told Joram, saying, he, that second horseman, came even unto them, and cometh not again. The second one failed to return. And the driving of this guy that's coming in is like the driving of Jehu, the son of Nimshi, for he driveth furiously. In other words, he's driving like a maniac, king. This guy's out of control. As you can imagine, King Joram was beginning to worry just a bit at this time. I'm sure he sensed the possibility of a coup. Why was Jehu driving so furiously? What was on his mind? So he and King Ahaziah set out together to confront Jehu. Strength in numbers, right? Well, verse 21 carries the story even further. And Joram said, make ready, Ahaziah. And his chariot was made ready. And Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, went out, each in his chariot, and they went out against Jehu to meet him in the portion of Naboth the Jezreelite. And it came to pass, when Joram saw Jehu, that he said, "Is it peace, Jehu?" And Jehu answered, "What peace? So long as the whoredoms of thy mother Jezebel and her witchcraft are so numerous, so many." Now both Joram, and Ahaziah were fully aware that Jehu's mission had not been a mission of peace. Fast forward with me to verse 23. And Joram turned his hands and fled and said to Ahaziah, "There is treachery, O Ahaziah." And Jehu drew a bow with his full strength. We can imagine he's a pretty strong man. And he smote Jehoram between his arms, and the arrow went out at his heart, and he sunk down in his chariot. Different artists have depicted it different ways, but you can get the idea. Now, the rest of the story is pretty gory. You wouldn't want to read this at lunchtime or at dinner time as you're sitting down, your meal's before you. King Jehu had been instructed to kill the entire house of Ahab, due again to Ahab's sinful worship of Baal, his defiance against the Most High God. Who was Ahab's wife again? Anyone remember? Say it again. Jezebel. So after Jezebel, Jehu went. Could Jezebel ply her trade with Jehu? Could she kind of sweet talk Jehu? Well, she thought she would try. Watch what happened as we come to chapter 9, verse 30. And when Jehu was come to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her face and tired her head. She didn't get tired in the head. That's a word for a headdress, meaning she put on her favorite headdress and looked out the window. Whoa, boy. What a ploy. Jezebel pulled out all the stops. Out came her eyeliner. Out came her rouge. I imagine a splash or two of her most potent perfume. Why, that had always worked before. Why wouldn't it work now with Jehu? What did she think? That Jehu had come to offer a ride? And let's just go for a picnic today. Let's go out for a little Sunday stroll. No. When Jehu looked up at the window that he knew belonged to Jezebel, he said, "Who's on my side?" Well, when he said that, he said, "Who's on my side? Who?" And 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out at him. They were in the room with Jezebel. Let's skip ahead to verse 33. And he, Jehu, said, "Throw her down." So they, the 2 eunuchs, threw her down. And some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses, and he, Jehu, trode her underfoot. And when he was come in, he did eat and drink, and said, "Go, see now this cursed woman, and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." Not a pleasant way to die. But Jehu wasn't worried about pleasantries. He was on the Lord's business. And all because not Jehu, but Ahab had purposely and willfully turned his back on the Most High God when he had every opportunity, as Israel did, to make his confession. Notice 2 Kings 9, verses 35 and 36. And they went to bury her, but they found no more of her than her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. Apparently the bull mastiffs hadn't been fed that day. Wherefore they came again and told Jehu, and he said, "This is the word of the Lord, which he spake to his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, In the portion of Jezreel shall dogs eat of the flesh of Jezebel." Why? Because they didn't want Jezebel buried where people could go and honor the tomb of the lady Jezebel. She would be, as the Bible says, as dung in the field. Nobody would be able to locate her after that. The dogs ate Jezebel. Jehu went on, by the way, to do away with the entire house of Ahab. He destroyed them, just as the Lord had directed him to do through the young prophet Elijah had sent to anoint him. The elders of Jezreel, knowing of Jehu's fury, they didn't want Jehu coming to them in fury. They delivered the heads of all the sons of Ahab that were in Samaria, 70 men in all, to Jehu, and they did so in buckets. 70 buckets with 70 heads. I told you it's not a pretty picture, not one pleasant story, but it demonstrates the severity of God when dealing with those who willfully and defiantly turn their backs on him, as well as the law contract their forefathers had sworn they had the capacity to obey perfectly and consistently. Verses 10 and 11 summarize what happened in the house of King Ahab because of Ahab's defiance. Open defiance. Let's listen in as Jehu addresses the people. Know now that there shall fall unto the earth nothing, meaning nothing undone, that being the idea, of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spake concerning the house of Ahab. For the Lord hath done that which he spake by his servant Elijah. So Jehu slew all that remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, and all his great men, and his kinfolk, and his priests, until he left none remaining. You know, aren't we fortunate today that God's not dealing with us according to the law contract? And we think a tornado that kills a few people is God's wrath today pouring out on the world. Not so. He's not imputing the sins of the world to the world. We're living in an age of grace. But back here under that law contract, they've been given strict instruction. The same would be true of the household of King Ahaziah. 42 members of that household were remaining, and all 42 of them were slain. In a very real sense of the expression, through King Jehu, the Lord was cleaning house. But the Lord didn't want Jehu to stop with the households of Joram and Ahaziah. Jehu would be very subtle about what he was going to do next. This is an interesting story. He had a proclamation to make to the people, as seen in verse 18. And Jehu gathered all the people together and said unto them, Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu shall serve him much. Really? What's he talking about? He then summoned all the prophets of Baal, along with all their servants and all the priests connected with Baal worship. And he told them that he had a great sacrifice to make to Baal. We can only imagine their delight, these Baal worshipers. They had to be excited at the prospect by what we see in verses 20 and 21 of chapter 10. And Jehu said, proclaim a solemn assembly for Baal. And they proclaimed it. And Jehu sent through all Israel, and all the worshipers of Baal came, so that there was not a man left that came not. And they came into the house of Baal, and the house of Baal was full from one end to the other. What a crowd. Sort of like grace assemblies today, wouldn't you say? No, not so. Jehu even had the person who was responsible to maintain the vestry hand out the robes that were used in Baal worship to all those who were present in that room. All those who had come to the great sacrifice Jehu had proclaimed. Of course, Jehu's interest was to make sure that Baal worshipers, all those Baal worshipers, be easily recognized when it came to what he intended to do next. So he had them wear the royal robes. I'm sure many of you have pretty much figured it out by this point, but Jehu wanted no mistakes made. The Baal worshipers would be easy to recognize wearing those Baal worshiping robes. Jehu then directed the Baal worshipers to search and make sure there were no servants of the Lord, the Most High God, in that room. I'm sure the Baal worshipers were most happy to comply. To the worshipers of that false god, Baal, this was Baal's hour. No one else had a right to be in that room. Not only had they received a formal invite, this was to be an exclusive gathering for just them. These folks felt honored to be in the room. However, their solemn ceremony was to be about to come to an end. This is where we jump ahead to verse 24. And when they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings, Jehu appointed 80 men without. He appointed 80 men to stand outside and at the ready. And we can certainly be sure they were well prepared. And Jehu said, if any of the men in this room, whom I have brought into your hands, escape, he that letteth him go, his life shall be the life for that escapee. All right, 1 Kings 10. Let's see, you see that verse, 1 Kings 10:25. And it came to pass, as soon as he, Jehu, had made an end of offering the burnt offering, that Jehu said to the guard and to the captains, go in and slay them. A room full of Baal worshippers. Let none come forth. And they smote them with the edge of the sword. And the guard and the captains cast them out and went to the city of the house of Baal. After slaying all those Baal worshippers, Jehu's men emptied the images out of that temple built to Baal, and they burned the images. They then broke down the image of Baal himself and demolished the house that had been built for Baal worship. Verse 28 puts the period at the end of the sentence where Baal worshippers, the Baal worshippers of Samaria, the capital city of the northern kingdom, was concerned. It's a short sentence, but it says it all. Then, thus, Jehu destroyed Baal out of the land. What a lesson that could have and should have been learned by King Jehu about the Most High God's attitude toward the worship of Baal, or false gods for that matter. The first commandment of the law had been what? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. The people of Israel hadn't made a mistake. They were shaking their fist at the Most High God. But the image of Baal was something they could see, and they didn't want to worship a God they couldn't look at while they were worshiping him. Even if that meant they had to create that God for themselves and conjure up the notion that he was really indeed a God. If we were to stop right here, it looks to me like the northern kingdom's 10th king, King Jehu, had turned the corner. As far as Israel's meriting another bucket of wrath was concerned, surely under the rule of Jehu, they had avoided the pouring out of bucket number 4. Wouldn't you say? He's not only destroyed the households of the previous 2 wicked kings, eliminating their dynasties altogether, he went on to destroy the image of the false god, Baal. He went on to demolish the temple of that false god and eradicate all the Baal worshippers from the land. At this point, we'd say, what a king. What a man. Boy, he's God's man, is he not? He was leaving no stone unturned in his work on behalf of the Most High God. No stone unturned, that is, until we come to the very next word in the very next verse. Verse 29. Howbeit, nevertheless, from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, Jehu departed not from after them. To wit, the golden calves that were in Bethel and that were in Dan. Remember those golden calves? King Jeroboam, the first king, had those golden calves erected to be worshipped so that the people of the northern kingdom wouldn't venture to the southern kingdom to worship the Most High God and to sacrifice to him. So now he got rid of Baal, but he's leaving the golden calves in Bethel and Dan. What a disappointing letdown. Lest you forget, King Jehoram he didn't want those people traveling to the southern kingdom. So he put those golden calves in place, telling Israel that those golden calves were now their gods. Boy, how gullible could these people be? He set up one in Dan, he set the other up in Bethel. Jehu did nothing to halt or even to diminish the worship of the Israelites to those 2 golden calves. He kept it going. He allowed that to continue right on as if nothing at all had changed. The Lord did reward Jehu for eliminating Baal worshippers from the land. He told him that his children to the 4th generation would sit on the throne in Israel for what he had done in obeying the Lord. But notice verse 31, where we see Jehu's appreciation of the Most High God. And beyond appreciation, adoration of the God who had been there to work on his nation's behalf from the outset of their history. What a telling verse is verse 31. A verse that not only demonstrates Jehu's personal dedication to the Lord, who had given him his kingship in the first place, but a verse that also describes the mindset of the people over whom Jehu had been ruling. But Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart, for he departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, which made Israel to sin. The verse we've just read reveals Israel's worthiness for the 4th bucket of wrath to fall on their heads while Jehu was still king. Let's go back very quickly and reveal the contents of bucket of wrath number 4. Here they are, Leviticus chapter 26, verses 23 through 26. First comes the promise in verses 23 and 24. And if you will not be reformed by me by these things, Israel, but will walk contrary unto me, then I will also walk contrary unto you and will punish you 7 times for your sins. Next, we see description of the pouring in verses 25 and 26. I will bring a sword upon you that shall avenge the quarrel of my covenant. And when you are gathered together within your cities, I will send the pestilence among you, and ye shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy. And when I have broken the staff of your bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in one oven. That's famine. That's severe famine. They shall deliver you your bread again by weight, and you shall eat and not be satisfied. Not enough to eat. Notice that with the pouring of the 4th bucket of wrath, God is not just preparing to walk contrary to his people, as he had been with bucket number 3. He is walking contrary to the nation at this point. They had been acting as though the Most High God was not their God. They wanted nothing to do with him. Now God is going to act as though they're not his people. They're actually his enemies at this point. This would not mean captivity at this point, not with bucket number 4. But bucket of wrath number 4 would certainly begin taking the nation to the direction of bucket number 5. Bucket of wrath number 4 would mean that Israel was just 1 step shy of being taken out of their land altogether. God had brought them into the land. God could take them out of the land. But before that would take place, God would bring a sword upon them, meaning the enemy would begin to encroach upon their territory to the point that Israel would actually begin to lose ground. They would begin to lose their territory. That's the sword that was sitting in bucket of wrath number 4. And it was about to fall. King Jehu had set the nation up for the 4th bucket of wrath. Not only that, the mindset of the people was the same mindset as the king. They were openly, defiantly, flagrantly shaking their fists in the face of Almighty God in spite of all that he'd done for them. And the confession was still sitting on the table. Make your confession that you're failing this contract. Call upon me. I'll be there to show mercy and grace to you folks. Through their activity, Israel was calling for bucket number 4. We just read in 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 31, that King Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord God of Israel. These buckets were designed to prove that very thing would be the case. They were designed to prove to Israel that their forefathers had lied when they had sworn that Israel had the capacity to fulfill the law. Bear in mind, Israel could have avoided all these buckets of wrath. All Israel had to do through the course of each of these buckets was admit their law contract failure and call upon the capacity resident in the name of the Most High God to become for them what they had no capacity whatsoever to become for him. King Jehu hadn't made that confession, and neither had the nation. They just kept marching like a college band at halftime. They kept marching steadfastly and defiantly, contrary to the Most High God, who had not only proven their incapacity, he had also proven his capacity over and over and over again. Now look at the very next verse, verse 31, where we see God's response to King Jehu and Israel's obstinacy. In those days the Lord began to cut Israel short, and Hazael smote them in all the coasts of Israel, from Jordan eastward all the land of Gilead, the Gadites and the Reubenites and the Manassites, from Aroer, which is by the river Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan, the territories where the Israelites had settled when they first came to the Jordan River during the days of Joshua. Israel was now losing to Hazael, king of Syria, as you can see there on our map entitled Israel Cut Short. This is the 4th bucket. I will cut you short, is what the verse said, and we see that he would bring a sword against the land when the 4th bucket fell. And on our slide there entitled Israel Cut Short, same picture but 2 sides, same land, you can see that the sword did indeed begin to come on Israel as Hazael smote them in the coasts of that nation. Don't forget that during King David's time, during King Solomon's time, this territory was secure. It belonged to Israel. But Israel's 4th bucket of wrath, the bucket that had been teetering, had now fallen. And Israel was reaping the consequences of the wrath of God that was sitting in bucket number 4. When you first look at that short statement, in those days the Lord began to cut Israel short, in 2 Kings chapter 10, you might not appreciate the marker that that statement represents, but it's there nonetheless as a marker. With that simple 10-word statement, we see the pouring out of bucket number 4. God had said that he would bring a sword against Israel should this bucket fall to avenge the quarrel of his covenant. Another interesting expression. Were they quarreling over the covenant? In a sense, they were. Israel had no problem thinking they were living up to the covenant. God said they were not. They said they were. God said you're not. They were quarreling all right. But he would bring a sword against Israel should this bucket fall to avenge that quarrel of his covenant. And that's precisely what was taking place at that period of time. Now, we find that Hazael was king over Syria when this took place. The king before him was Ben-Hadad, and Ben-Hadad had fallen ill. I'll just give you the real quick take here. When Elisha came to Damascus, where Ben-Hadad had been residing, Ben-Hadad sent Hazael to inquire from Elisha as to whether he would recover. And it took 40 camels to carry the goods that Hazael was taking to Elisha. The prophet Elisha had answered King Ben-Hadad's question, but more importantly, the Lord revealed to Elisha something about Hazael's future. Hazael just smote Israel in the coasts. But this took place before that smiting occurred. I want to close out today's lesson with 2 verses. You won't see them, but I'm going to read them to you. 2 Kings chapter 8, that brought Elisha to tears. They are verses 12 and 13 of 2 Kings chapter 8. I'll just read them. And Hazael said, "Why weepeth my lord, Elisha?" And Elisha answered, "Because I know the evil, Hazael, that thou wilt do unto the children of Israel. Their strongholds wilt thou set on fire, and their young men wilt thou slay with the sword, and wilt dash their children, and rip up their women with child." Verse 13 of 2 Kings chapter 8, and Hazael said, "But what? Is thy servant a dog, that he should do this evil, this great thing?" And Elisha answered, "The Lord hath showed me that thou shalt be king over Syria. Elisha's prophecy came to fulfillment with the pouring of Israel's bucket. Hazael did indeed smite Israel with the sword. How quickly would Israel merit the pouring out of bucket number 5? Well, the answer to that's going to come in our next lesson as we continue our journey through the Bible. Stay with us.